Story number 1. The Stranger in the Cabin. Montana's wild beauty is both breathtaking and humbling. The vast expanses of forest, jagged peaks, and endless skies make you feel like the last person on Earth. That's exactly what drew me and my friends to rent a remote cabin there in the fall of 1995. We were looking for adventure, a week of hunting, drinking, and laughing in the kind of solitude that only the Montana wilderness could offer. The group consisted of me, my best friend Nate, and 2 brothers, Mike and Eric. We'd known each other for years and were no strangers to remote getaways. The cabin was everything we wanted: isolated, rustic, and surrounded by miles of untamed wilderness. The nearest town was an hour away, and the dirt road leading to the cabin was so overgrown that it felt like a trail lost to time. We arrived on a crisp Sunday afternoon, unloading our gear and settling into the cabin. The place was basic but functional: a single large room with a fireplace, a couple of bunks, and a small kitchen. There was no electricity, no running water, and no distractions. Perfect, or so we thought. The first few days were uneventful. We spent our mornings hiking and hunting, our afternoons gutting and cleaning game, and our evenings drinking beer around the fireplace, swapping stories and joking about the eeriness of the cabin. Feels like the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie, Mike had joked on our first night. We all laughed, but the truth was, the isolation did have a way of creeping under your skin. It wasn't until the 3rd day that things started to feel off. We'd been out all day, tracking elk through the dense forest. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I was the first to step inside, and immediately, I knew something was wrong. The air was colder than it should have been, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones. The cabin was a mess: chairs overturned, our gear scattered across the floor, and the remains of our lunch dumped out onto the counter. The fireplace, which we'd left smoldering that morning, was cold and dead. "Did a bear get in here?" Nate asked, his voice tense. "No way," Eric said, pointing to the locked door. "Nothing's broken. No windows, no door. How could anything get in?" The realization settled over us like a weight. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing had come in from the outside. Then we saw the writing. On the wall above the fireplace, carved into the wood in deep, uneven letters, were 3 words: "I am still here." The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. The letters were jagged, as if someone had hacked them out in a hurry. But they were fresh, the edges of the wood splintered and raw. "What the hell?" Mike muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Who would?" "Don't," Nate interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't try to explain it. Let's just pack up and leave." "We can't leave," Eric said. "It's already getting dark. The road's bad enough in daylight." "Then we'll wait until morning," Nate said. "But we're not staying in here tonight." We grabbed our gear and set up a makeshift camp outside, just far enough from the cabin to feel safer but close enough to keep it in view. None of us could sleep. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt like it was coming from something or someone watching us. The cabin stood in the moonlight, silent and dark, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at us. At some point during the night, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of shadow passing one of the windows. But when I shone my flashlight, there was nothing there. The first light, we packed up and left. None of us wanted to stay a minute longer than necessary. As we loaded the truck, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. The writing on the wall had changed. Instead of "I am still here," it now read, "You should leave." My blood turned to ice. I grabbed Nate and pointed, but by the time he looked, the letters were gone. The wall was bare, the wood smooth and unmarked. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "Yeah," I lied, my voice barely audible. "Let's go." The drive back to town was silent. None of us spoke about what had happened. And when we dropped off the cabin keys at the rental office, No one mentioned the writing. The woman behind the desk asked how our trip had been, her cheerful tone clashing with the tension hanging over us. "Fine," Nate said curtly, and we left without another word. Years later, I still think about that cabin. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe someone had been squatting there. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe we were just exhausted and imagining things. But none of those explanations feel right. There was something in that cabin. Something that didn't want us there. And when I close my eyes at night, I can still see those words carved into the wall, as clear as the day we found them. If you ever find yourself renting a remote cabin in the wilderness, take my advice. Don't go inside if something feels wrong, because sometimes the things that wait for you in the dark aren't willing to share their space. Story number 2. The clock that stopped. It was the summer of 1989, and my parents had rented a cabin on the shore of Lake Michigan for a week-long family getaway. I was 10 at the time, old enough to sense when something wasn't quite right but too young to understand the weight of it. My parents, eager for a break from the monotony of suburban life, had chosen the cabin for its charm, a rustic little retreat with wooden walls, creaky floorboards, and a view of the lake that seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't until we arrived that I noticed the clock. The cabin was cozy but worn, its corners collecting cobwebs and its air thick with the scent of aged wood. Above the fireplace hung a large, antique clock. Its face was cracked, and the brass pendulum swung slowly behind the glass, ticking away with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. It was the kind of clock you'd expect to find in an old house, something that belonged to another time. "That thing's a bit creepy," my mom remarked as she unpacked the groceries, her eyes flicking toward the clock. "It adds character," my dad replied with a chuckle, always one to brush off her unease. I stared at the clock, feeling a strange pull toward it. There was something unsettling about the way it ticked, the sound louder than it should have been, echoing through the cabin even when I was in the next room. The first few days passed uneventfully. We swam in the lake, roasted marshmallows by the fire, and played board games late into the evening. At night, the forest surrounding the cabin came alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The clock, with its steady ticking, became a part of the background noise, a constant presence that I couldn't quite ignore. It wasn't until the third night that the strangeness began. I woke suddenly, my eyes snapping open in the dark. The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing against your ears. Then I heard it, the clock. Its chime rang out, clear and deliberate, cutting through the stillness like a blade. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 3 a.m. The chime sounded again, then again, and again. 12 times it rang, each note reverberating through the cabin. Though I hadn't heard anyone wind the clock since we arrived. It wasn't just the sound that unnerved me. It was the way the air seemed to change, growing colder, heavier. In the morning, I asked my parents about it. My dad shrugged it off, saying old clocks had a way of working even when they shouldn't. My mom, however, looked uneasy. "It shouldn't be chiming," she said quietly. "Not if no one wound it." The next night, it happened again. This time, I wasn't the only one who heard it. My mom woke as the chimes echoed through the cabin, her hand clutching my dad's arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's just the clock. It's not supposed to chime," she insisted. We all sat in silence, listening to the chimes. When they stopped, the cabin felt different. The warm, inviting atmosphere had been replaced by something colder, more oppressive. My dad tried to laugh it off, but his unease was clear. On the 5th night, the chimes came again, but this time, they didn't stop at 12. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the entire cabin was vibrating with each note. My mom was the first to notice the time. "Look," she said, pointing at her watch. "It's 3:05, but the clock on the wall wasn't moving. His hands were frozen at exactly 3 o'clock. The pendulum still swinging in defiance of the motionless time. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The cabin fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. My dad stood, his face pale. "We're leaving," he said simply. We packed in record time, throwing our belongings into suitcases and bags without a word. As we loaded the car, I glanced back at the cabin. The clock's face seemed darker, its cracked glass reflecting the faint light of the moon. I could have sworn the pendulum had stopped. The drive home was tense. None of us spoke about the clock or the strange events of that final night. But the weight of it lingered. It wasn't until years later that my mom told me what she had found while tidying the cabin earlier in the week. Hidden behind a loose panel near the fireplace, she'd discovered a faded photograph of a man and a woman standing in front of the clock. On the back of the photo, someone had scrawled a single line, "Time will stop for us too. I haven't been back to that cabin. And I don't plan to. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear the faint echo of chimes in the distance, ringing out across the years like a warning." I've come to believe that the clock wasn't just marking time, it was marking something else. Something older and darker that I don't want to understand. If you ever find yourself in a cabin with an old clock, take my advice. Don't stay too long, because when time stops, it's not always for the living. Story number 3. The Vanishing Cabin. In the autumn of 2007, my friends and I embarked on a hiking trip along the Appalachian Trail, a journey meant to pull us out of our mundane lives and into the heart of nature. The group consisted of 4 of us: me, Danny, Claire, and Rachel. We were experienced hikers, accustomed to long days on the trail and nights under the stars. This trip, however, would be one none of us would ever forget. We'd planned a 4-day trek through one of the more remote sections of the trail, hoping to escape the crowds and immerse ourselves in the raw beauty of the mountains. The first 2 days were perfect. The air was crisp, the leaves painted in fiery hues of red and gold, and the trail was deserted. By the 3rd day, though, the weather turned. Clouds rolled in, the temperature dropped, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of rain. It was late in the afternoon, and we were tired, cold, and eager to find a suitable spot to camp. That's when we saw it. The cabin appeared out of nowhere, tucked into a clearing just off the trail. It was small and weathered, its wooden walls streaked with moss and its roof sagging slightly under the weight of years. A stone chimney jutted from one side, though there was no sign of smoke. It looked abandoned, yet strangely intact, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. "This is perfect," Danny said, his breath visible in the chilly air. "Better than setting up the tents." Claire frowned, her gaze lingering on the cabin. "Doesn't it seem odd? There's no road, no sign of a path leading here." "It's probably an old hunter's cabin," Rachel said, shrugging off her pack. "Who cares? It's warm, it's dry, and I'm not about to turn it down." I agreed, though I couldn't shake a vague unease as we approached. The cabin's door creaked loudly as Danny pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The single room was sparse but functional: a wooden table and chairs, a stone fireplace, and a few shelves lining the walls. An old oil lamp sat on the table, its glass cracked but intact. "Home sweet home," Danny said with a grin, tossing his pack onto the floor. We spent the evening drying off and warming ourselves by a fire Danny built in the fireplace. The cabin, though cold and musty, felt like a blessing after the long, grueling day. As the fire crackled and our dinner cooked, we began to relax. Rachel found an old journal tucked into one of the shelves, its pages yellowed and brittle. "What's it say?" Claire asked. Leaning closer, Rachel flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing. "It's just notes, I guess. Whoever wrote this talks about hunting, the weather, stuff like that." She paused, her fingers brushing over one of the pages. "Wait, this is weird. Listen to this." She read aloud. The cabin only appears when it's needed. It watches, waits. Those who stay must never forget. It is not a gift, but a warning. The room fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a chill. Danny laughed nervously. Sounds like someone had too much moonshine. Maybe, Rachel said, closing the journal. Though she looked uneasy. We went to bed not long after, spreading our sleeping bags on the wooden floor. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I drifted off to sleep listening to the wind howling outside, the cabin creaking softly in response. When I woke, the first thing I noticed was the cold. It was biting, far worse than the night before, and I realized the fire had gone out. The second thing I noticed was the sky. There was no roof above us, just the pale, pre-dawn light filtering through a canopy of trees. I sat up in a panic, my breath catching in my throat. We were no longer in the cabin. The four of us were lying in our sleeping bags on bare ground, surrounded by tall grass and scattered leaves. The cabin was gone. Guys, I shouted, shaking Danny awake. Wake up! One by one, they stirred, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they took in our surroundings. The clearing was empty, save for the remnants of our campfire, now just a pile of cold ash. The cabin, along with everything inside it, had vanished. What the hell? Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Where is it? It was here, we were here. There's no way we could have moved, Claire said, her face pale. This doesn't make any sense. We searched the area, circling the clearing and combing the nearby woods. But there was no trace of the cabin, no foundation, no scattered debris, nothing to suggest it had ever existed. Even the trail we had followed to reach it seemed to have disappeared, swallowed by the forest. We left the clearing as soon as the sun rose, our nerves frayed and our imaginations running wild. The hike back to the car was eerily silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we finally reached the trailhead, we were too shaken to celebrate. The only sound was the crunch of gravel underfoot as we loaded our gear into the car. Later, I tried to find information about the cabin, old maps, local legends, anything that might explain what we'd experienced. But there was nothing. No record of a cabin in that part of the forest. No reports of similar sightings. It was as if the cabin had been a figment of our collective imagination. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I can feel the rough wood of the cabin's floor beneath my sleeping bag. Hear the creak of the door as we stepped inside. Smell the faint scent of smoke from the fire. It was real. I know it was real, but it's gone. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and come across an old cabin where there shouldn't be one, think carefully before stepping inside. Because some places aren't meant to be found, and some shelters aren't meant to keep you safe. Story number 4. The Song in the Forest. Vermont in autumn is the kind of place that feels almost too perfect to be real. The rolling hills, the fiery reds and golds of the leaves, and the crisp air all create an idyllic escape from the chaos of modern life. My girlfriend, Anna, and I had always wanted to spend a weekend in a secluded cabin, away from everything, and in October 2010, we finally made it happen. The cabin was everything we'd hoped for, small, cozy, and nestled in the woods at the edge of a quiet lake. It was the kind of place you'd see on the cover of a travel magazine, complete with a stone fireplace and a wide porch overlooking the water. The forest stretched endlessly behind the cabin, a sea of towering pines and maples that seemed to hum with life even in the stillness. It was perfect, or at least, seemed that way. The first day passed peacefully. We spent the morning exploring the area, hiking along the lake, and soaking in the tranquility of the woods. By afternoon, the sky had turned a soft gray, and the wind carried a faint chill, so we retreated to the cabin. The evening was spent by the fire, sipping wine and enjoying the silence broken only by the crackling of the flames. By the time we went to bed, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. Then came the singing. It started sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of Anna shifting restlessly beside me, her brow furrowed in sleep. At first, I thought it was just the wind. A faint melody carried through the trees. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't random. It was a song. The voice was soft and melodic, almost hypnotic, rising and falling in a hauntingly beautiful tune. It seemed to come from the forest behind the cabin, weaving through the trees like a siren's call. I sat up, straining to hear, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. "Do you hear that?" Anna whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, unsure of what to say. There was something unnatural about the sound, something that didn't belong in the world we knew. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The cold night air bit at my skin, and the forest stretched out before me, dark and impenetrable. The singing was clearer now, its ethereal notes drifting from somewhere deep among the trees. Anna followed reluctantly, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Maybe it's someone camping nearby," she suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. "Out here? In the middle of nowhere?" I shook my head. "Let's just take a quick look." We walked cautiously into the woods, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The song grew louder as we moved, its melody impossibly perfect, yet filled with an undercurrent of sorrow that made my chest ache. The trees closed in around us, their branches forming twisted shapes that seemed to reach out toward us. Then we saw her. She stood just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam, her figure barely visible among the shadows. She was tall and slender, draped in a flowing white gown that seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. Her hair was long and dark, cascading over her shoulders in tangled waves. She wasn't moving, but her head was tilted slightly as if listening. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly, almost gracefully, and began to walk deeper into the forest. Her movements were fluid, like she was gliding rather than walking. The song continued, but now it felt closer, wrapping around us like a physical presence. Without thinking, I stepped forward, drawn by some inexplicable urge to follow. Anna grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Don't," she whispered, her voice filled with fear. I stopped, my heart racing as the figure disappeared into the darkness. The singing faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves in the cold wind. We returned to the cabin in silence, our nerves frayed. Neither of us slept that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the windows, set my teeth on edge. The forest felt alive, its presence pressing against the walls of the cabin like a living, breathing entity. The next morning, we debated whether to stay or leave. I wanted to pack up and go, but Anna insisted we stay. "It was probably just someone out for a late-night walk," she said, though her voice trembled. "Let's not ruin the trip over something silly." Reluctantly, I agreed. That night, the singing returned. It was louder this time, more insistent, and accompanied by a faint tapping sound on the window. I froze, staring at the glass. But there was nothing there, just the reflection of the room and the endless blackness beyond. Anna clutched my arm, her face pale. "It's her," she whispered. "She's out there." I grabbed the flashlight again, though my hands shook as I clicked it on. Stepping cautiously toward the window, I swept the beam across the trees. For a moment, there was nothing, and then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the forest, her white gown glowing faintly in the darkness. Her face was hidden by the shadows, but I could feel her gaze, cold and piercing, fixed on the cabin. The flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, she was gone. The next morning, we packed up and left. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The memory of the singing and the figure in the woods burned into my mind. On the way back to town, we stopped at a small diner to grab breakfast. The waitress, a friendly older woman, struck up a conversation, asking how we'd liked our stay. When I mentioned the cabin, her expression darkened. "You stayed there?" she asked, her voice lowering. Didn't anyone tell you about the girl? What girl? Anna asked, her voice hesitant. The waitress leaned in, her eyes darting around as if to make sure no one was listening. Back in the 1950s, a young woman stayed in that cabin with her fiancé. They were supposed to get married, but he called it off, left her alone out there. She hung herself in the woods behind the cabin. Some folks say she's still there, singing her sad song, looking for him. We didn't say much for the rest of the drive home. The thought of the woman in white, her haunting melody, and the piercing cold of her gaze stayed with me long after we left Vermont. I haven't been back since, and I doubt I ever will. If you ever find yourself in a cabin deep in the woods, and you hear a song drifting through the trees, don't follow it. Some voices aren't meant to be heard, and some stories are better left untold. Story number 5. The Locked Room. Alaska in winter is an unforgiving place, where the icy wilderness stretches endlessly, and the silence feels almost alive. In December 1992, I decided to escape the chaos of the city and spend a week in isolation, fishing in one of the remote lakes I'd heard so much about. A friend recommended a cabin just outside of town, owned by a local who rented it out to adventurers like me. The cabin itself was exactly what I was looking for, rustic but sturdy, with a fireplace, a small kitchenette, and enough space for one person. It was nestled on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by dense pine forest, the perfect retreat. When I arrived, the owner, an older man named Harold, handed me the keys with a firm handshake. "It's all yours for the week," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But there's one thing you need to know. There's a room at the back of the cabin that's locked. It's not in use, and there's no reason for you to bother with it." His words struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. Old cabins like this often had quirks, storage rooms, structural issues, things that owners didn't want guests messing with. I thanked him, loaded my gear inside, and prepared to settle in. The cabin was cozy, the fire crackling warmly as the sun set behind the snow-covered trees. I cooked a simple dinner and spent the evening reading by the fire, the silence outside broken only by the occasional howl of the wind. It wasn't until I went to bed that I noticed the door. It was at the far end of the hallway, its surface plain and unremarkable except for the heavy padlock securing it shut. Something about it felt off, though maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to pool around it, or the faint, almost imperceptible hum I thought I heard when I stood near it. I told myself it was nothing, just the creaks and groans of an old cabin settling in the cold. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the locked room was more than Harold had let on. At some point, I drifted off to sleep, only to be woken in the dead of night by a sound that made my blood run cold. A faint whispering, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I sat up, my heart pounding, straining to hear over the sound of the wind outside. The whispers were soft, almost melodic, but the words were indistinguishable. They seemed to come from the direction of the locked room. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept down the hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. The whispering grew louder as I approached the door, though it remained muffled, as if whoever or whatever was behind it didn't want to be heard too clearly. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The sound stopped abruptly, the silence almost deafening in its suddenness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the flashlight beam steady on the door. Finally, I shook my head, blaming my imagination and the isolation for playing tricks on me, and returned to bed. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the locked room. Harold's warning echoed in my mind, but curiosity gnawed at me. I had to know what was behind that door. Maybe it was just an old storage room, but I needed to see it for myself. Using a small set of tools from my tackle box, I worked on the padlock until it clicked open. My hands trembled as I pulled the door open, revealing a small, empty room bathed in cold, gray light from a tiny, barred window. The walls were bare except for one thing, a single sentence scrawled in jagged, Uneven letters across the far wall. They are coming. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the words. The paint, or whatever substance had been used, was old and faded. But the message was unmistakable. I stepped inside, shining the flashlight around the room. But there was nothing else. No furniture, no belongings, no sign that anyone had been here in years. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent, filling the cabin with a low, unearthly hum. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, pressing against my ears. I tried to block them out, but they grew louder, the words still indistinguishable but filled with a sense of urgency and malice. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, my pulse racing as the whispers turned into something else. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the cabin. They stopped just outside the bedroom door. The doorknob rattled. I don't know how I survived that night. At some point, the noises stopped, leaving me in a silence so profound it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. When dawn finally broke, I grabbed my things and fled the cabin, leaving the door to the locked room wide open. When I told Harold what had happened, his face went pale. He muttered something about the cabin's history, about strange events and guests who had left in the middle of the night, never to return. He refused to say more, and I didn't press him. I just wanted to leave. Years later, I still think about that week in the cabin. I've tried to make sense of what happened, to rationalize it as stress or exhaustion. But deep down, I know the truth. There was something in that room, something old, something angry, and something that hasn't forgotten me. If you ever find yourself renting a secluded cabin in the wilderness, and you see a locked door, heed this warning. Some rooms are locked for a reason. Story number 6. The cabin that glowed. The Colorado wilderness has always been a place of beauty and mystery. Endless trails weave through dense forests, open meadows, and jagged peaks, offering solace to those who seek it. In the summer of 2015, my friends and I, Alex, Jenna, Mark, and I, decided to spend a weekend camping in one of its more remote corners. None of us could have predicted the terror we would encounter deep in those woods. We arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, our packs heavy but our spirits high. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as we set out, casting long shadows across the forest floor. After a few hours of hiking, we found a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the perfect spot to set up camp. As the stars began to dot the night sky, we built a fire, shared stories, and laughed under the canopy of ancient trees. It wasn't until the fire had burned down to embers and we were preparing to turn in for the night that Jenna spotted it. "Do you see that?" she asked. Her voice hushed. We followed her gaze and saw it. A faint glow, barely visible through the trees. It flickered like a candle, soft and golden, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. "Maybe it's another group camping nearby," Alex suggested. "No way," Mark replied. "We're miles from the nearest trailhead, and we haven't seen a single person all day." Curiosity got the better of us. Grabbing flashlights, we set off toward the light, the forest eerily silent around us. The glow grew brighter as we approached, revealing the outline of a structure, a small cabin, weathered and leaning slightly to one side, its windows grimy and its wooden walls covered in moss. "What's a cabin doing out here?" I wondered aloud. "Old hunting shack, maybe," Mark offered. As we stepped closer, the light inside the cabin flickered and went out, plunging the structure into darkness. Alex shone his flashlight at the windows, but the interior was impenetrable, the grime on the glass reflecting the beam back at us. "Hello," Jenna called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. The cabin stood silent, its empty windows staring back at us like hollow eyes. "Let's check it out," Mark said, already moving toward the door. "Are you serious?" Jenna hissed. "What if someone's in there? Then we'll apologize and leave." Mark said with a shrug. But it's probably been abandoned for years. Reluctantly, we followed him. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest. Inside, the air was damp and musty, thick with the scent of rot. The cabin was empty, its interior lit only by the faint beams of our flashlights. A single table stood in the center of the room, covered in a thick layer of dust. The walls were bare, save for a few nails where pictures might have hung long ago. "There's no one here," Mark said, his voice echoing softly. "Then where did the light come from?" Alex asked. None of us had an answer. We returned to camp uneasy, the cabin looming in the back of our minds. Sleep came fitfully, the forest around us seeming too quiet, too watchful. Sometime after midnight, I woke to Jenna shaking my shoulder. "The light's back," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I sat up, following her gaze. Through the trees, the glow had returned, brighter now, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Mark and Alex were already awake, their faces pale in the dim firelight. "I saw something," Alex said. "A shadow. It moved past the window when the light came on." We decided to investigate again, our fear outweighed by a mix of curiosity and the need for answers. As we approached the cabin, the light dimmed, flickering like a dying flame before extinguishing entirely. We stopped just short of the porch, the air around us heavy and cold. "That's not normal," Jenna whispered, her breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. We stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, when Alex pointed at the window. "There," he hissed. I turned just in time to see it. A faint figure, barely visible against the darkness, standing inside the cabin. His features were indistinct, its edges blurred like a shadow that didn't quite belong. And then it was gone, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. We didn't go inside the cabin again. Instead, we retreated to our campsite, our nerves frayed. The light didn't return that night, but none of us slept. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, sent waves of fear through us. By morning, we were ready to leave. As we packed up, Jenna noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt around our campsite were footprints, too many to belong to just us. They were faint but unmistakable, circling our tents and leading back toward the direction of the cabin. "We didn't hear anyone," Alex said, his voice shaking. "How is that possible?" We left the forest that day, the cabin and its strange light haunting our thoughts. Later, I tried to find information about it, old maps, local legends, anything that could explain what we'd seen. But there was nothing. No record of a cabin in that part of the woods. No reports of strange lights or sightings. It was as if the cabin didn't exist, or as if it didn't want to be found. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that forest. I've tried to rationalize it, a trick of the light, a prank, an overactive imagination, but deep down, I know better. The cabin was real. The light was real. And whatever cast that shadow in the window, it was real too. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and see a light where there shouldn't be one, think twice before investigating. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story number 7. The knocking in the night. Winter in Oregon has a way of isolating you. The snow-covered trees, the endless silence, and the sharp cold create a world that feels entirely separate from the rest of reality. My family and I, my wife Emma, our 8-year-old son Max and I, had decided to rent a secluded cabin in the mountains for a week-long winter getaway in December 2008. We wanted peace, quiet, and a chance to disconnect from the chaos of our daily lives. What we got was something else entirely. The cabin was perfect at first glance. It was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines, with a wide porch and large windows that looked out onto a pristine blanket of snow. Inside, the fireplace crackled warmly, and the cozy wooden interior gave it a welcoming charm. We spent our first day exploring the property, building a snowman with Max and warming up with hot cocoa by the fire. By the time the sun set, the sky turning a deep purple. We were all exhausted but content. That night, after Max was tucked into bed, Emma and I sat by the fire, sipping wine and enjoying the rare silence. The snow was falling lightly outside, the flakes glinting in the moonlight. It was the kind of peace we'd been craving. Around midnight, we turned in for the night, the warmth of the fireplace still lingering in the air. At 2:13 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud, frantic knocking at the front door. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. The cabin was old, and the wind had picked up during the night, howling through the trees. But then it came again, 3 sharp knocks, followed by a pause, then 3 more, louder this time. Emma stirred beside me, her eyes opening groggily. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her face pale in the faint light coming from the window. "Who would be out here at this hour?" I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the front door. The knocking continued, steady and insistent, as if whoever was outside knew we were inside but refused to speak. My heart pounded as I reached for the doorknob, hesitating before turning it. "Be careful," Emma whispered from the bedroom doorway. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The cold night air rushed in, stinging my skin. The porch was empty. Beyond it, the snow stretched out undisturbed, glowing softly under the moonlight. There was no one there. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. It echoed back at me, the forest swallowing the sound. I stepped out onto the porch, my breath visible in the freezing air. That's when I saw them, footprints in the snow. They were deep and erratic, circling the cabin as if someone had been pacing around it. They led from the porch to the side of the cabin, then back again, looping aimlessly. "Is anyone there?" I called again, louder this time. Silence. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Emma was waiting in the living room, holding a kitchen knife. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Footprints," I said, but no one was there. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Neither of us slept, and we kept the lights on, jumping at every creak and gust of wind. When morning finally came, we were both exhausted but relieved to see the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees. I decided to investigate the footprints in the daylight. To my shock, they were gone. The snow around the cabin was pristine, with no sign that anyone or anything had been there. Even the prints I'd seen on the porch the night before had vanished, as if the snow had filled itself in during the night. But the snowman Max had built the day before was still intact, the scarf fluttering gently in the breeze. The next night, we tried to convince ourselves it had been nothing. A prank, perhaps, or a trick of the wind. We went to bed earlier, determined to put it behind us. But at exactly 2:13 a.m., the knocking came again. This time, it was louder, more frantic, as though whoever or whatever was outside was growing impatient. I jumped out of bed, adrenaline surging through me. Emma grabbed Max, who had woken up crying, and held him close. "Don't open it this time," she pleaded. I didn't plan to. Instead, I stood by the door, listening. The knocks came in bursts of 3, followed by a pause, then 3 more. I moved to the window and peeked out, careful not to let myself be seen. The porch was empty, but I could see the faint outline of footprints circling the cabin again. They seemed deeper this time, more chaotic, as if whoever was out there was pacing faster. The knocking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. The rest of the week passed in a blur of fear. The knocking came every night at the same time, always in bursts of 3, always without any sign of who or what was causing it. We stopped sleeping, stopped trying to enjoy the days. We were trapped, too scared to leave but equally terrified to stay. On the final night, the knocking came earlier, around midnight. This time, it was accompanied by something new, a faint whispering sound, like voices carried on the wind. They were unintelligible but insistent, growing louder as the knocks grew more frantic. When morning came, We packed our things and left without looking back. I don't think any of us spoke during the drive back to the city. A week later, I called the rental company to report what had happened. The woman on the other end of the line was polite but dismissive. "You're not the first to mention strange noises," she said. "But no one's ever been hurt, so we've never looked into it." "No one's ever been hurt?" I asked, incredulous. "What about the footprints? The knocking? The whispering?" She hesitated. "Footprints? I've never heard anyone mention footprints." I hung up, more unsettled than ever. To this day, I can't explain what happened at that cabin. I've tried to rationalize it. A prank. An animal. Something caught in the wind, but none of those explanations fit. The memory of those knocks, the invisible footsteps, and the whispering voices still haunt me. I haven't been back to the mountains since, and I don't plan to. If you ever find yourself in a secluded cabin in the woods, and you hear a knock at the door in the middle of the night, do yourself a favor, don't open it. Some doors are better left closed.